in the middle of the greatest migration in human history, and that's the migration of the rural population into the world's cities. We've passed the point, as you've already heard, where we have 50% of the world's population living in urban areas, and we are well on track in the next couple of decades to hit 70%. And I put it to you that this is actually really very good news, because the urban density and concentration of intellectual and creative resources and talent in the city makes them the real hubs of innovation and creativity. And you'll find this documented repeatedly by people who study urban environments and the city, the work of Richard Florida, Ed Glazer, so on and so forth. They're also key to poverty reduction. It's often thought that cities make people poor. Cities don't make people poor. They attract poor people because they're better places to be poor than the countryside. And it's in cities that poor people get to be rich. They're also key to improved human health. And I would argue, contrary to what Adam Newton said earlier in this session, I would argue they're actually really good for the environment. There is a misconception that cities are places where you have increased pollution, environmental degradation, and so on and so forth. But that's actually due to the concentration of the population. The per capita burden that city dwellers put on the environment is far, far lower than the per capita burden of people living in the countryside. And we shouldn't mistake the concentration of those burdens in the cities as being indicative of the overall burden. So, cities are crucibles of innovation, but they're also prone to infrastructure lock-in and path dependency. Nowhere is this better illustrated than the fact that the central city road plans of many of our European cities were laid down in Roman times. This is London. The map at the top left-hand corner is Roman London. On the right, medieval London. The left, the city of London today. And you can still see that basically the essential street plan is preserved over a period of 1600 years. Paris, of course, being a notable exception. So I want to look a little bit more at this phenomena of lock-in and path dependency. Lock-in was well described by the economist Paul David in his account of the persistence of the QWERTY keyboard as the standard English keyboard that we have on our computers today. Some of you may know why this was introduced. Why don't we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G as the top line of the keyboard? It was introduced to slow down typists who were typing so quickly that they were jamming the typewriter keys. Now, when I took up my appointment at the Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee, in one of the US leading technology labs in the early 1980s, I had one of these things on the left on my desk, a golf ball typewriter. Already that did not have keys to jam, but it still had the QWERTY keyboard. Within a couple of years, that typewriter was replaced by one of these things on the right, the Apple II computer. No printing device inherent in there at all. Still the QWERTY keyboard. Why the QWERTY keyboard? Because, of course, it was actually embedded in a whole lot of other things, such as touch typing techniques, learning to touch type, secretarial courses, so on and so forth. So we can see the way in which technologies as bits of kit become embedded in behavior and therefore become locked in. The other phenomenon I wanted to talk about briefly is path dependency, which is illustrated here by the space shuttle boosters. And if I tell you that the space shuttle boosters, the diameter of them was determined by the width of a Roman horse's ass, you may well be surprised. Now, there's a long chain of events here that I don't have time to go through, since I only have 15 minutes to talk altogether. But basically, those space shuttle boosters were made by Morton Fire Coal in the Midwest. They had to be transported by rail. They went through railway tunnels. The width of the railway tunnels was determined by the gauge of the tracks. The width of the railway tracks was determined essentially by the axle length of a medieval cart, because that was the jigs on which the first railway carriages were actually built, and the axle width of the medieval cart was actually based on that of the Roman war chariot, and therefore you can see how over a couple of thousand years, in fact, the width of a Roman horse's ass shaped, at least in some degree, the technology that actually took the shuttle into orbit. And I want to challenge us to think about both of these phenomena in relationship to technology and to city. Both of these phenomena emphasize to us that technologies are social systems. This is the only word slide I'm going to show you today. So, technologies are social systems mediated by materials and devices. And in fact, the dichotomy, I would argue, that I think Greg referred to in his last talk, between behavioral change and technology change, kit change, I would argue is actually a false dichotomy. You can't change behavior without changing the kit with which people interact. You can't change the kit with which people interact without actually requiring or forcing or nurturing some kind of change in behavior. And cities themselves are technologies, or rather they're nests of technologies, technological systems, which both shape and are shaped by the urban form. It's not only the built infrastructure that shapes cities, but as often as not, it's mundane technologies, and it always has been mundane technologies. So consider this, for example. This is the sailing ship. It was one of the early technologies that shaped the world in which we live in today, and particularly the location of cities. It was the sole means of moving large, heavy cargoes over long distances. And as a result, 23 of the world's 30 largest cities are on the coastline, and many of them make extensive use of reclaimed land and are therefore at or below sea level. This means that extensive areas of those cities are prone to flooding and to sea level rise. I should point out, by the way, it's often claimed that increased hurricane activity due to climate change has caused the exponential increases in the costs of wind and water damage to coastal cities over the past 50 years. That is actually not the case. The increased costs of damage are absolutely entirely due to asset location. We put expensive infrastructure in silly, vulnerable places. Now, wealthy cities can protect themselves and protect their assets through major infrastructure investments, such as this one here, the Thames Barrier. And of course, the Dutch, our neighbors across the Channel, have been the world leaders in this kind of hydraulic engineering, but it leads to serious lock-in. As soon as you start to go down this way of protecting yourself against sea level rise, you're basically committing yourself to reproducing and renewing that infrastructure periodically ad infinitum. It's also not a viable strategy for poor countries, particularly poor countries which are have a lack of resources such as rock. Bangladesh, you may be surprised to know, Bangladesh imports rubble. It imports other people's demolished buildings simply to build roads and regular office buildings and homes and so on, because they have a shortage of stone. This kind of infrastructure development is not going to be a viable way of protecting the Ganges Delta against sea level rise. But I think, interestingly, when we talk about disruptive technologies, it's as interesting to look back sometimes to traditional technologies as it is to look very forward in a futuristic kind of way. And what you see here is a couple of examples from East Asia, from Vietnam in the top left-hand corner, from the Tonle Sap Lake area of Cambodia on the right-hand side. The response of the poor to the problems of the unaffordability of land on which to construct, and also huge variations in lake levels in particularly the case of Tonle Sap, which the lake actually retreats several miles between the rainy season and the dry season. And they've responded to this basically by constructing their entire communities on the water. Interestingly enough, the Dutch, those Dutch who are the past masters of the hard engineering approach to protecting us from flooding and so forth, are the very people who are now looking closely at deriving inspiration from those examples to design and construct buildings that will actually be designed to float. And you can see here at the top left-hand side a picture of a house, which is one of a village that's currently constructed in the Netherlands, and in the bottom right-hand side, the architect's impression of an apartment building which is being considered for the port of Rotterdam. Now, while on the topic of water, let's think about another mundane technology, and that's this one here, the siphon-operated flushing toilet, first patented in the mid-19th century and famously improved on and promoted by Thomas Crapper. Now, the universal adoption of the water closet, remember it's called the water closet, was made possible by two largely independent public health measures that took place during the 19th century. The first was in response to the great stinks of London and Paris of the 1850s, was the desire to put smelly sewers underground to reduce the unpleasantness of having them in the open. And the second was the desire to provide clean drinking water to the rapidly growing industrializing cities, and the illustration here, of course, is of the famous Broad Street pump, the handle of which was removed by John Snow in order to actually curtail an outbreak of typhoid. Now, what happened, interestingly enough, was that the flush toilet linked these two infrastructures together. No one in their right mind would ever have designed a system where you purify billions of litres of water to drinking quality to use 40% of it that reaches the home to flush toilets with. And yet it's become the global sanitation standard, even though it's not sustainable. There's an interesting possible convergence at this time between the interests of the people in the wealthy older cities where this infrastructure is beginning to crumble, the interests of people in wealthy parts of places like the United States where they're moving to semi-arid zones such as Orange County, California, and the poor in the developing world to actually devise technologies which disconnect the water, provision of drinking water from the handling of human waste. Here's another piece of kit that's done a lot to shape the city. It's, of course, the air conditioner. This is Lutyens' wonderful design of the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., where until the 1940s, British diplomats received hardship pay because of the unpleasant summers. That hardship pay went away in the 1940s when air conditioning was installed in the embassy. And the air conditioner, probably more than any other technology, has altered global geography in very profound ways, enabling sleepy southern towns like Atlanta, illustrated at the top there in the early part of this century, to become the New York of the South in only a few decades, and at the cost of massive human sprawl. The air conditioner also has resulted in the homogenization of global architecture around the world as regional adaptation in building styles, adaptation to climatic conditions became superfluous, and the result is a massive increase in energy use, not only to provide that cooling in these homogenized buildings, but also because of the urban heat island effect. And again, there are some interesting things happening at the moment where architects and engineers are looking back to traditional practices in order to get inspiration for the future. So you can see on the left-hand side at the top there, the traditional Queenslander house, 360-degree air circulation, large overhanging eaves, and the inspiration that's provided in the bottom left-hand corner here for a building on the UBC Okinawan campus in British Columbia to provide similar shading and so on. You can see also on the right, in the middle here, the traditional wind towers of the Middle East, which have been adopted by Norman Foster in his designs for Masdar, the city in the desert, to bring cooler air down into the city itself for cooling, using the latest aerodynamic knowledge that we have from people who design airplane wings to design modern versions of these cooling towers. I'm running short of time. I apologize for that. I would just say no discussion, of course, of technology shaping the city can ignore the car. It's hard to believe that in 100 years we went from this, 4 miles an hour with a red flag, to the stage whereby the car itself was actually one of the absolutely dominant factors in shaping the urban form. Although, interestingly enough, the speed of that transition, less than 100 years, I think actually it gives me some source of optimism in the sense that it does show how quickly major infrastructural systems can change when there's a high level of consumer demand for them. A century ago, average road speeds in London were about 11 miles per hour. They're pretty much that today. And congestion won't be solved by hybrid cars or electric cars. What are the alternatives? Well, we've seen the Boris bike become an established feature of London in the past few years. What about the Boris car? I think this is going beyond the zip car in the sense that this could be a vehicle that was constantly on the move, that you would be able to summon it on your mobile phone, it would know where you are, you would simply program into your phone where you're going, how many people, and these constantly moving driverless vehicles would be computationally rerouted to optimize the route to pick up you and take you where you wanted to go along with other passengers. So it's a sort of hybrid taxi bus operating in real time. If I had more time, I could go on to talk about the role of other technologies, the electric light bulb, the elevator, and so on, but I'll leave you to contemplate those for yourselves. But I think it really is important and interesting to think about how these small technological innovations actually work through and have huge impacts on our largest technology of all, the city. Before closing, I just want to introduce one more idea. We've heard from Greg about disruptive technologies, but I think we also need to think about transitional technologies. And I would actually argue that the hybrid car is a transitional technology. And indeed, I would agree with Greg that we won't be seeing hybrid cars. I would have said in about 20 years' time. He says 30, 40 years' time, because I think that they are actually a way of transitioning us from liquid fuel-driven cars to other technologies. We've seen transitional technologies in the past. On the left here is my favorite example, the oil lamp. That enabled us to go from using sperm whale oil, which, by the way, is the only form of energy humanity has ever given up. We still use more of every other energy source today than we ever have in the past, except for sperm whale oil. And that transition to kerosene was made possible, at least in part, by the fact that you could burn it in the same lamp. So in a sense, you can see how the hybrid car represents an analog of that. And then, of course, air conditioning, fire extinguishers, the phase-out of chlorofluorocarbons, which were damaging the ozone layer, was possible because of the introduction of alternative gases that could be used in pretty much the same kit. So my closing thought is that in overcoming lock-in and path dependency and in pursuit of a flexible city, one that is able to preserve the characteristics which give us a sense of place and enable us to value a place, but also is able to move and transition in response both to technological innovation, environmental pressures, and demographic change. This is not simply a design problem, it's a challenge to the imagination, and I leave you here with one of the artworks of Thomas Saraceno, who I find particularly inspiring in the creative imagination that he brings to the idea of the future city. Thank you.
For more big thinking about the future, go to iq2if.com.